Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Welcome to the monthly webinar put on by ABPMP. Today, our speaker is Andrew Spagni, talking about the future of BPM. Andrew is one of our board advisors and also has been doing BPM. He's probably one of the godfathers of BPM. He's been doing it over 30 years, published 3 books, Andrew, if I'm correct.
That's correct. Yep.
I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrew, to get started. So thank you, everyone. Please, any questions you may have, submit them on the question panel. We'll address all the questions at the end of the webinar. And then if there's any follow-up that's needed, you could send an email to webinars@abpmp.org. Go ahead, Andrew.
That's great, Tony. Thank you very much. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to speak at ABPMP. Today's topic is the future of BPM. And if any of you heard my talk last year about how the practice of the process professional is evolving, you will recognize that this actually builds on that presentation. So let me just start out with a couple of quotations. The late, great Yogi Berra, manager of the New York Yankees, when he was asked whether the Yankees would win yet another World Series pennant, he said, "It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future." And I think that's true for BPM. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future, because the landscape is changing so radically, and we'll talk more about that. The other quotation is one from the financial services area, and in fact, my financial advisor says this all the time, that past performance is no guarantee of future results. And that's true for BPM as well. So no matter what we might have done in the past, and as Tony mentioned, I've been playing in the sandbox of process improvement management since 1992. It's a long time, 30 years, but no matter what we've accomplished in the past, it's no guarantee that we can do the same or better in the future. So just 2 quotes, food for thought. And what I'm going to be talking about today, or my talking points today, is mainly about the future of BPM. Is it dull or is it bright? And but I'm going to set up some context first. I'm going to talk about the early days of BPM, what's happened in the last decade, the current situation, and then I'll get into the future of BPM. So the early days of BPM, when I did many projects, I've done over 170 process improvement projects, many of them in the 1990s and in the first decade of this century. Before the year 2000, no one talked about BPM. We talked about reengineering, we talked about process improvement, we talked about process management, monitoring and governance, but no one talked about BPM until Gartner coined the phrase BPM, business process management. I believe it was 2000 or 2001. And very shortly after, my friend, the late Peter Fingar, who was also on the advisory board for ABPMP, co-wrote a book called Business Process Management, the Third Wave, where he claimed that BPM and process thinking will obliterate the business IT divide and utterly transform information systems. Well, that was maybe a little bit over the top, but it certainly got a lot of attention. And that was in 2003, just about the same time that I wrote my book, Business Process Management is a Team Sport, Play to Win, and I joined ABPMP as the very first chair of the Education Committee. And ABPMP has made a huge contribution to the field of process, starting with the definition of what BPM is. ABPMP defined BPM as both a management discipline and a set of technologies that support managing by process. And that definition has survived the test of time. Now we have version 4.0 of the CBOC, and I believe it's still in that book. So the early days, we were talking about BPM as a management discipline. We were talking about the importance of customer focus. We were talking about looking at end-to-end processes. However, as time progressed, things changed. And in the past decade, BPM unfortunately has lost some of its glitter. In part, it's because of the evolution of other methods and technology. So for example, in 2010 through 2014, there was a lot of emphasis on customer experience. There was actually a council, the Chief Customer Officer Council was established, and in 2014 they published a study that illustrated that as many as 10% of Fortune 500 companies had a Chief Customer Officer. Now, just compare that to how many Fortune 500 companies have a Chief Process Officer, and you will note that the customer experience folks had a lot more traction than we did in the process field. Then, and around the same time, maybe a couple of years later, we started with robotic process automation, which is actually a misnomer, but it got a lot of activity and attraction. It really should be called robotic procedure automation, where software bots are used to automate small processes, most of the time procedures, high volume, high transactional things that people do. RPA does not redesign any processes. It simply automates what people do. But it got a lot of attention. Why? Because it had a huge role in terms of cost reduction. And around 2011 or 12, in the academic area, there was some work on process mining, mainly in Europe. Dr. Tom Davenport and I co-wrote an article in 2019 on process mining. I believe that is in MIT Sloan. And basically, what we argued is that it's a technology that's going to help a lot of companies, especially those who have ERP systems. At the time we wrote that article in 2019, there were a dozen or so vendors, with Celonis being the principal market leader in process mining. And we thought it was pretty cool that because process mining was based on event logs and was a data-based method of looking at some end-to-end processes, especially in ERP systems such as SAP. Well, fast forward to 2021, now there were over 30 vendors in process mining, and this technology has gained a lot of traction. Around the same time, and even earlier, there was a lot of emphasis on digital transformation, probably largely driven by MIT's focus on the digital economy. And MIT did a great job, and they basically said that digital transformation is more about strategy than it is about technology, and that the cornerstones are process, customer experience, and business model. And so to this day, digital transformation is on the lips of many CEOs. I'm not so sure we have done as good a job as we could as process professionals in helping people understand the central role of process in digital transformation. Low code has really come into its own in the last couple of years, where pre-configured templates are used by so-called citizen developers, again, to automate not processes, not end-to-end processes, but tiny processes or procedures. There are some issues with low code, and I'll talk about that later, but it certainly, users have been responsive to low code. And it's a technology that we as process professionals should at least be aware of. Perhaps the most exciting thing is hyperautomation. That was a term that Gartner coined a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago. IDC calls it intelligent process automation. And I believe Forrester calls it digital process automation. But all three terms mean the same thing. It's the integration of various tools and technologies to improve the performance of large processes. And this is something that I'm going to argue that process professionals need to be adept at. So that's what's happened in the past decade, and the focus has been much more on customer experience and various aspects of technology than process improvement itself, or BPM. Current situation, what's the current situation here? Well, technology continues to accelerate. Take a look at artificial intelligence, for example. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are moving ahead at lightning speed. Some BPM professionals are being left behind, especially those BPM professionals who are focusing on simply modeling business processes and not improving them. Those BPM professionals who are focusing just on cost reduction, or those who are focusing just on standardization. Not to say that cost reduction and standardization is not important. These things are indeed important, but value creation is even more important, and it has to be integrated. Some leading BPM vendors have repositioned themselves. Vendors such as Appian and Pega, who previously positioned themselves as BPMS, or Business Process Management Suite vendors, now position themselves differently. Appian is focused on low code. Pega is focused on customer experience. And BPM is increasingly being associated with incremental improvement. Now, there's nothing wrong with incremental improvement, but BPM is way more than that. And so that's the current situation. So what is going on here? So some people are asking, is BPM dead? In fact, as far back as 2008, that question was raised, and Peter Fingar wrote on the BP Trends website, BPM is dead, long live BPM, or viva la BPM. In 2014, Elise Olding at Gartner posted, BPM is dead, long live big change. And in 2019, Scott Francis, the founder and CEO at BP3 Global, one of the better BPM consulting firms, argued that BPM is not dead, and he believed that it will thrive and adapt. And so do I. I believe that BPM is going to thrive and adapt, but I believe the extent to which it thrives and adapts depends on each of us individually and collectively. We have some persistent problems. In one recent survey by Accenture, this is just last year, where they surveyed over 3,000 executives, 75% of the respondents saw different business functions or departments competing against one another instead of collaborating. Now, that was the same thing 25 years ago. So very, very concerning that this is still the case. I have observed that department heads continue to put their own department's needs ahead of corporate needs, and they hoard data. And that's concerning and that's problematic because data is what increasingly needed to leverage process and digital improvement. And vendor silos and practitioner silos further complicate the landscape. Practitioner silos are particularly problematic. The customer experience teams tend to sit in different part of the organization than the process improvement teams. The process improvement teams tend to sit in different parts of the organization than the information technology teams and the digital teams and the process mining teams. Vendors seem to have a preference for control over collaboration. We have seen both Appian and Pega acquire robotic process automation companies instead of just collaborating with other firms who do that kind of work. So these are persistent problems, frankly, and things that we should be concerned about. So what is the future of BPM? Well, many, many years ago in 1986, there was a group. Frankly, I don't think they were that good, but they did have a couple of songs, Timbuk 3, and they wrote the song, "The future's so bright, I gotta wear shades." Well, the future of BPM is so bright that you gotta wear shades if and only if process professionals take the right actions. And what are those actions? Focus on customer experience, better engage leaders in BPM, and integrate technology into process improvement. So that's what I'm going to talk about in most of the presentation today. But the future of BPM will be dull if process professionals fail to act, if they continue to model small processes, typically inside of departmental boundaries. The future of BPM is going to be dull if process professionals focus more on cost than value creation. The future of BPM is going to be pretty dull if process professionals fail to collaborate with other groups. And just to say a bit more about this, process professionals have to stop modeling for the sake of modeling. And you may think that this is an exaggeration. However, I was in the UK 3 years ago working with a automotive manufacturer, training some of their people in process improvement management. And I asked them, how many processes have you modeled? And two of the people were modeling experts, and they proudly said 212. And then I asked them, how many of those have you improved? And faces in the room got red. The answer was none. And then I asked them, how did you model those processes? Did you model the current state, the as is, or the future state? And they said, oh, it's kind of a blend of the two. Imagine how poor that is. That's got to stop. Process professionals have to stop working inside just one department and focusing just on cost reduction or just on standardization. Not that cost reduction and standardization are needed, they are, but value creation is even more important. So how do we go about creating a bright future? Well, there are three things that we should do. The future is so bright, you have to wear shades. Number one, focus on customer experience. Advocate that successful performance improvement must start with the customer, whether that's process improvement or hyperautomation or digital transformation. It's got to start with the customer. And the only way process improvement teams can do that is by working closely with customer experience teams and sharing with leaders the central role of process in resolving customer experience issues. Indeed, I think that's probably the most important thing that needs to be done, is to illustrate to leaders that any major problem in customer experience, it can be resolved by improving and managing an end-to-end process that touches the customer at that point in the journey map. Second thing, the future is so bright you have to wear shades. The second thing to do is we must integrate technology in process improvement. Now, there are 5 levels in the capability maturity model that Carnegie Mellon and the Software Engineering Institute developed several decades ago. And it starts out with ad hoc and then basically managed and defined and optimized. So basically, we starts out with ad hoc, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized. And my experience is more in process improvement in digital than it is in software development, but I can tell you that about 80% of the firms that I've seen are firms that are working at the bottom 3 maturity levels. And you can ask yourself, let's look at the process column there. Where is your organization? Is there some talk about process improvement and not much action? Or maybe a few process improvements have been done, but largely within departmental boundaries, or improvement and measurement of larger processes has been attempted, or a number of end-to-end processes have been improved, or continuous process improvement based on fact-based metrics are in place. So that's the process view, and we could do the same for the digital improvement. And I think one of the opportunities that we have as process professionals is to integrate hyperautomation and digital tools in process improvement. So what that means basically is process professionals need a working understanding of RPA. RPA applies only to small procedures and small processes, but if the opportunities for RPA are identified through process mining and through using process improvement techniques, then the deployment of RPA can be very, very useful and can result in creating a lot of value for the organization and reducing cost. Same thing for low code. Low code by itself has some issues because while certainly it uses predefined templates and while many users are asking for it, the long-term integration issues need to be handled. And what happens when the citizen developers move from one unit in the organization to another? What happens when a particular low-code application has to be debugged and those people who developed it are no longer there? Those are interesting questions. Process professionals need to have an understanding of that and indeed even integrate low-code and RPA and process mining into their own process improvement efforts if we want the future to be so bright that you have to wear shades. And the third thing that we need to look at is better engage leaders in BPM. And arguably, this is the most important of the 3. We need to get better at engaging leaders in BPM by getting them aligned on the basics, by doing less talking and more pragmatic results, by thinking big, promoting quick wins to maintain momentum, and by measuring the things that really matter. So let me talk about each of those 4 things for just a few minutes. it's really important for the leadership team, the top team, to be aligned on BPM with things as basic as what is BPM? What are the real benefits of BPM to the business? Why should the organization invest in BPM, and why now? Who else is doing it? And where does BPM stand relative to the many other priorities that the organization has? If the leadership team is not aligned on these basic factors, it's going to be very hard for BPM to come into its own. And so that's the role of process professionals, is to get the leadership team aligned. Less evangelism and more pragmatism. Results matter. Results matter significantly. And yes, we want to talk about how great BPM is, but what's more important is simplifying things, finding ways to do things faster, okay, and do it for the very large end-to-end processes. And that leads us to the next point, indeed, which is thinking big. Thinking big, whether it's APQC or SAP. APQC has had this template of process classification framework. They've had it for, like, I don't know, almost 30 years. Hasn't evolved much, but it's in wide use. SAP has really focused on less than a dozen value streams, like order to cash, procure to pay, hire to retire. These are the big processes. Indeed, there's only about a dozen or so large processes in any organization. And the way you name those processes, the nomenclature you use in those processes, should be specific to your company. And that's where the process professional can make a huge contribution in getting the leadership team to understand how these end-to-end processes create value, not just for the customers, but for the company as well. The fourth thing that I think that really makes a difference is measurement. And measurement is not an or, it's an and. Well, of course, most organizations start out with traditional metrics like revenue, gross margin, net profit, cash flow. Okay, and that's not going to change. But what we want to do is add to those some customer-focused metrics, like how many customers do we have? What's the revenue per customer? What's the margin per customer? And what is the churn? What is the customer churn? And once we get really good at it, then we can even add to that another layer of granularity. What is our performance in terms of perfect order delivery? Orders that are delivered on time, complete, and error-free. What is our performance like in terms of responding to inquiries right the first time? What is our performance like in terms of perfect request to receipt or perfect new product introduction? First time right, complete, error-free. So process professionals have an opportunity to educate and to advise the leadership team on the metrics that really matter, and then go even beyond this to looking at the particular end-to-end processes, procure to pay, hire to retire, plan to produce, and so forth and so on, and creating process-related metrics that go on the dashboard of the leadership team. So those are four things, I think. If process professionals do those four things, then the future is going to be so bright that you've got to wear shades. Now, let me share with you a few examples. Engaging leadership is a complex undertaking. And most of the time, it's really the leader who has passionate passionate about both customer experience and process, and then we just take advantage of that. This first example is an example of a chemical company that had an imminent merger, and the global VP supply chain of the dominant company was passionate about customer experience. In fact, he was so passionate that he created a customer bill of rights on his own before we got involved. And his customer bill of rights said that on day one of merged operations, each customer has the right to receive what they ordered when it was promised to them, complete and error-free. And this individual understood that process is what creates value. And they integrated IT simply because the merger involved two different ERP systems. And they got the people involved and produced outstanding results. Now, how did we find this individual? He came to us. And sometimes it's easier for an outsider as opposed to an insider, but insiders have greater access to the potential leaders who understand the importance of customer experience and business process. So that's example number one. Example number two, the chief financial officer was concerned about churn at a cable TV and internet service provider company. Now, frankly, in my experience in the 170 projects I've worked on, there's only been half a dozen times where the sponsor has been chief financial officer, but this individual was concerned about churn and concerned about customers and concerned about the impact to the bottom line when the company lost customers. So there was a project launched to improve service restoration because they were concerned about how long it took to restore service. And only modest gains were made, but the gains were significant enough that it convinced the CFO to talk to the CEO to consider a customer-focused, process-based approach to developing enterprise strategy. So that is a second example. And again, how did we find the CFO? He came to us. So people inside organizations have much better access to the leadership team, and you can identify who are those leaders by asking questions, probing questions, not by be evangelical about BPM, but asking probing questions about performance and how we create value for customers. Richard Branson is known for stretching it all the time. And I think BPM professionals also can stretch it. What do I mean by that? It's important sometimes to stretch the scope of a project. People talk about scope creep. Sometimes scope creep, when planned, can be a good thing. I worked with a bank in the Northeast, US Northeast, on the mortgage approval process, and our sponsor was the vice president of operations, and he was mainly concerned about reducing the time and cost of handling the mortgage documents. He really didn't want to look at it end to end. And it was up to us to illustrate to him that it was worthwhile looking at the mortgage approval process, starting with the application being developed and ending with the applicant making their first payment on the final approved mortgage. So end to end. But the sponsor was reluctant until we were able to demonstrate that as many as 12% of incoming applications were inaccurate or incomplete. And until we were able to demonstrate that the underwriting group really had no fast track process for those applicants who were well known to the bank and who were longtime bank customers. So stretching the scope, getting it beyond just one department, can be a good thing. And in addition, so all of these things lead to a systemic view of the organization. And it starts with a mental model. Instead of looking at just organs, let's look at the whole human being. Instead of looking at components, let's look at the bicycle. Instead of looking at just departments, let's look at the entire enterprise. And this perspective was basically documented by Alan Braish, who was the founding partner of Rummler Braish, after he had left Rummler Braish and had rejoined Kepner-Trago in a book called How Organizations Work. And he really was one of the people who understood that process is at the center of performance, but leadership and strategy matter enormously. And there's much more to organizational performance than process alone. Goals, human capabilities, knowledge management, structure, culture are all important, as is issue resolution. Now, perhaps this is a little bit too much, perhaps this is a bit too much, but an enterprise view of performance is something that will help process professionals to make sure that the future is so bright, you've got to wear shades. So in summary, and I hope that you've submitted a few questions. I look forward to responding to your questions. But in summary, if we want to make sure that the future is bright for BPM, we need to focus on what matters to customers. We need to think big. Think about those 10 or 12 enterprise processes, end-to-end processes. We need to integrate technology into process improvement. We need to, if you have an ERP system, if you're not using process mining to identify the opportunities for RPA, you're missing a big opportunity. So integrate technology, take advantage of hyper-automation, do whatever is possible to engage leaders, because without leaders being engaged, we don't have the budget and we don't have what's needed to overcome the obstacles that typically arise in any major process improvement effort. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's equally important to stop modeling just for the sake of modeling, stop working inside just one department. And I know how hard that is, especially if organizational issues are forcing professionals to work inside one department, but we got to stretch the scope and stop focusing just on cost reduction or just on standardization. So basically, that's what I had to say. Here are some references. If you liked what I had to share with you today, you can click on these links and you'll see the articles that I've written. As both Steve Jobs and Elon Musk emphasized, the no silo rule is really, really important. So thank you so much for your attention. And it's time for your questions, and I'll turn it back to Tony. Perhaps you can share with me what some of the questions are that people would like to have answered.
Sure. So just to repeat, folks, anybody who has a question, just please enter it in the questions box, and we'll get to everyone before the webinar is over. Just a couple comments, Andrew. You made some really good points, and I just wanted to add a couple of things. So you talked about APQC's process classification framework. Even though it's been around as long as it has, you're right, they have not evolved that at all. Contrary to what has been done with the SCORE model, which is the supply chain operational reference, they're on version 12. So they've evolved that. That's another pretty good framework, especially for makers of products and services. But the one thing I want to mention, you talk about ERP a lot. There actually are ERP vendors, and I downloaded a report, so I don't know who they are yet, but there are ERP vendors today that are doing low code, no code for ERP. And to your point, a lot of what is being done there is the procedural transactional level, and it's really not your end to end, right? So just something to point out there.
Good. Thank you for those comments, Tony. I appreciate that.
Okay, great. So first question, here you go. How should IACOEs be structured? I'm assuming he means intelligent automation. I think he means intelligent process automation. RPA, BPM, process mining as part of digital transformation initiatives.
Well, that's a really good question, and I think, I almost hate to say this, but it depends. It depends. Most of the time, what I've seen work pretty well for large organizations, and we're running one or more ERP systems, is to start off with process mining. Start out with process mining because process mining identifies the opportunities to deploy RPA and even potentially machine learning. Then conduct process improvement workshops. One of the big things that I see organizations don't do well is, they do the process mining stuff, which is based on event logs in the ERP systems, and that's good. But really, to paint a full picture, you need to workshop that, because there are things that are happening in the organization that have nothing to do with the systems. I mean, in most organizations, people have little Excel worksheets, to do workarounds because the system is not producing what they need. So start out with process mining, workshop it, identify the opportunities for RPA and machine learning, okay? If appropriate, at selected parts, you can build in a low code. That's what I would say in general, but really it depends. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, great. Here's another one. You mentioned the maturity levels, and the question here is, where would Lean Six Sigma fall in there? And do you think it's a practice that adds value? And if so, where within that maturity model?
Well, Lean Six Sigma, of course, is a methodology, and I think it's fairly well regarded. I think that Six Sigma itself, which focuses mostly on eliminating defects, has plateaued, but I think Lean Six Sigma as a methodology is still well respected and used in industry today. And where it stands in the capability maturity model depends on the organization and how much progress they've made. So if Lean Six Sigma is deployed only along departmental lines, then it'll be at the bottom one or two maturity levels. And if it's deployed in those large end-to-end processes with success, then it would be in the third and fourth level.
Okay, great. Here's another question. The relationship between, let's see here. Okay, this one is, what's your opinion on digital transformation as a driver for BPM?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Well, if we believe the people at MIT, and there's some really, really smart people at MIT, they believe that BPM, or process thinking, let me call it process thinking as opposed to BPM, is central to success with digital transformation. But not every organization has glommed onto that yet. And I think it's the role of the process professional to illustrate that if you want your digital projects to be successful, you need to focus them on the value creating end-to-end processes that create value for both customers and the company. So it's up to us to make that case to the leadership team. And in that event, I think BPM can be a big driver for digital transformation.
Okay, great. Um, okay, this is probably just more of a comment. APQC has about 20 PCFs for different industries. So the PCF has evolved based on requests and collaboration with our members and industry leaders. I would say that is true. Um, I don't know if there is any other comment there, Andrew.
Well, no, so my comment is, yeah, of course, APQC has got 20 different ones, but it's basically the same PCF applied to 20 different industries.
Right.
So what APQC has failed to do is to modify the language that they use to suit the needs of the different vertical sectors. They persist in using the same language from the 1990s. And maybe that's okay. And they certainly have done a great job at diving into a lot of detail because part of their practice is benchmarking as well. And so they've done some work in that area. But I think what they have failed to do is to understand that language matters enormously, and that tailoring the language we use to define processes to the individual company is pretty important.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't know if it's a criticism as more insofar as it's just a fact. The metrics are not integrated with the process elements, whereas SCORE does that. They have a lot of metrics and they do a lot of benchmarking, but if you take each process element and you wanted to string them together, you could do that, but there's no metrics to do that. In other words, they don't have metrics integrated with them. And that to me would be a huge step forward for them besides just changing the language. So good point. So I don't think we're here to really criticize APQC either.
No,
So
it's not, and it's not a criticism. It's just an observation.
yeah. Um, here's a question, probably a little bit more um, technical, but it's actually not a bad question. If I have an active Power BI tool, what other benefits will I have if I acquire process mining?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. I'm
Yeah,
not a technical person, so Power Business Intelligence tool. I mean, the IT community loves to throw in the word intelligence, right? Like intelligent process automation. What is the opposite of intelligent process automation? I leave you to ponder that question. But I don't know the answer to your question, but
I,
thank you for asking it.
I don't have a great answer, but I would just put out there that the process mining tools are geared towards looking at gaps in process based on event logs. You could probably do that with Power BI, but you'd have to literally program your Power BI to do what the process mining tools do. And I don't think any Power BIs do that to this day. At least I'm not aware of it. That's a good question. Here's another one. We've also developed multiple end-to-end process based on frameworks. This is just a comment again on APQC. Okay. Um, Referring to the topic of this great presentation, I would like to ask about the future of BPM in the context of BPM ambidexterity with particular emphasis on exploratory BPM.
Well, I'm not sure what exploratory BPM is, but I mean, in my consulting days, we would do a lot of discovery, high-level discovery around end-to-end processes. And if that's what you mean, then I think that the high-level discovery around order to delivery or idea to launch or hire to onboard is very, very important. And I don't know if you people noticed, but I didn't use the typical SAP value streams. I said order to delivery because customers care about order to delivery, but the company cares about order to cash.
Right.
Customers care about idea to launch, people who are being recruited care about requisition to onboard, not hire to retire. The company might care about hire to retire. So the way we define processes does and should vary depending on what we want to accomplish. And high-level process discovery, I think, is still a very useful tool. I mean, I've coached people on that, and in fact, if someone's interested on how to do it, just please reach out to me, and I'll share it with you.
Great. I have two more questions. Two more questions. Okay. He liked your answer, by the way. RPA automation specialist driven process improvement initiatives versus BPM professional driven initiatives success rates for overall end-to-end processes, which route is advisable?
They both are. They both are. I think in this day and age, if you do not integrate automation with your process improvement, I think you're not going to get optimal results. So I think both approaches are very important, and the extent to which you can integrate process mining, RPA, machine learning, and even low code tools into process improvement efforts, that is going to get you better and better results.
I'm going to take a stab at this question.
Go ahead.
I think what this person's asking is, what do you think the similarities and or differences, probably more so differences, are between BPM oriented people versus business analysts versus enterprise architects?
Okay. Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I think these role-based differences are very general, and it depends on the individuals. I have seen enterprise architects who are very business oriented, and I've seen enterprise architects who are very IT oriented. I've seen business analysts who are business oriented, and I've seen business analysts who are very IT oriented. BPM professionals tend to be, in general, more business oriented than IT oriented, but my argument is that has to change a little bit. So I think all three roles can play a crucial role in the future, and it's the individual as opposed to the generic role that makes a difference.
And it's probably also the number and types of projects you work on. If you were only working on IT related projects, then your skills and experience will be more, as you pointed out, IT focused. Whereas if you're doing a mix of both, you tend to have a broader cross-functional set of skills. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think it's some of the best people I've worked with are those people who've had experience in 2 or 3 different functional areas or departments, because they understand how the business works from various perspectives. So I think that is really important.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions here. They were all very, very good questions. Again, just if you want other questions answered, you could send them to webinars@abpmp.org. Otherwise, Andrew, thank you so much again for your presentation today. We had a very large crowd, and you certainly enlightened all of us in terms of where you think BPM is going and what we need to do to basically wear shades.
The future is so bright, you got to wear shades.
Yeah, I like that. And I'm old enough to remember that song too. So. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day, folks. Bye now.